welcome to another episode of Talking Conservation. Today we're in the Old Sun Inn in Saffron Walden with Douglas Kent, and we're going to be talking about the work Douglas has been doing here over 15 years or thereabouts, so it would seem. So we're going to talk about that. And later, as part of the additional content for the YouTube channel, we're hoping to get some footage of looking around the building so that our viewers can see some of the things we've been able to see. So Douglas, thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. So tell us a little bit about your background. I presume you left school and decided, I want to become a surveyor in conservation.
Well, I left school, and at that point, after A-levels, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. I'd always been interested in architecture, but I was being pushed more towards the landscape architecture side of things. In the end, I just pursued my strongest subject at school, which was geography, did a geography degree. And it was only after that that I got to hear about building surveying. I thought, oh, that's great. It's a practical subject. You're not desk-bound. And as I say, I was interested in buildings and architecture. And I think living in such a historic town rubbed off on me. I then studied part-time whilst working. Well, actually, before then, I went and did a period in a local firm of architects and surveyors, and decided that I was definitely interested in going into building conservation. So that was in the private practice, and shortly after that, joined what was the Property Services Agency, PSA, so went into the public sector, and at the same time studied part-time for a building surveying degree. And after that, we were, doing a lot of military work, actually, so complete contrast to what I came on to do later, where everything was true and plumb and square rather than all kinds of angles.
And characterless and soulless and painted in magnolia is my personal experience with military buildings.
Buildings.
And it was, so the PSA were privatised ultimately, and I stayed with the new privatised firm for a while, but then when I started to do an MSc, which one of my lecturers on my building surveying course had set up, I then did a 2-year studying building conservation.
Which course was it?
And that was a course that was run by Anglia Ruskin University.
Yeah.
And then at that time, a group of us decided to do the SPAB working party, the voluntary event down in Hampshire that year, repairing a church. And that was, as far as I recall, my introduction to the SPAB in any sort of real way. I think I maybe had heard of them a little bit. And as I say, the rest is history. I then later on came back from a holiday, I remember in Greece, opened up a magazine and then saw the SPAB Technical Secretary, then called, the role advertised, and applied, and have been with them the longest now I've done any job, actually, so nearly 25 years. So that's how it all started.
Am I right in thinking your predecessor, was it Nicola Sterry?
Predecessor but one, Nicola, yes. Was
Nicola, because I got into Scotland, I knew Nicola when she was in your role.
Right.
And she went down to the southwest, I believe, didn't she?
Yes, and worked for English Heritage and Philip Hughes, and then I think English Heritage / Historic England.
Yes, that's right. Yes, yeah. Okay, so you ended up at the SPAB, and you've been there, as you say, a long time. So in terms of the buildings here, you said you've lived in the Saffron Walden area for all your life, effectively. Yeah. So you've known these buildings since being a toddler.
I remember drawing them, actually, when I was about 14. We had to do an environmental science project around the town, and I actually spent an evening. I've still got the school book somewhere.
So you drew the building.
Yes.
And then how did you come about? Were you bought next door first?
Yeah, so there's always a building that, just mentioned with the sketch that I did, or drawing that as a schoolboy. And then later, I think it was about the time that Alec, Clifton Taylor was doing the really interesting series of 6 more English towns, on which he did a programme on Saffron Walden and featured the Old Sun Inn and talked about the building quite a lot in that. I then remember some years later meeting up with a colleague from the SPAB, and I'd literally come back from a trip to Russia, a work trip. I'd seen the building was for sale just before I went, but obviously you think, well, I can't really get involved in everything that then is entailed with buying an old building. There must be a huge amount of interest and so on. So that was the 2 cottages, numbers 25 and 27, as they were at the time. They hadn't been reunited back into one at that point. So I remember then speaking to a good friend of mine who was an estate agent in the town, but not the agent involved in the sale, and said to him, have you got any tips? And he gave me 2 pieces of advice. He said, well, first of all, I suggest that if you put in a bid, because it was after, suggesting people put in offers and to put their price in. So he said, make sure, and I suppose it's obvious with hindsight, but he said, make sure you put in an uneven amount so you're not likely to tie with someone else's bid. And secondly, he said, do put in a bit about your background in building conservation. And I found out afterwards that did help.
That tipped the balance.
Tip it in my favour,
right.
Which was really good to hear.
So I'd love to know a little bit of what history you know of the buildings that you first bought, in terms of who was the previous owner to you, for example. What sort of state was it in when you bought it? We'll see on the video later in terms of the state it's in now. But how much have you done, I suppose, since buying it? Yeah,
well, interestingly, and this is where things do come full circle to some degree, I found out after becoming involved in the Old Sun Inn that my employer, the SPAB, actually had a big involvement with the building from the 1930s through to the 1960s. In the 1930s, they were left a big wad of money, and by someone called Ernest Cook, who's a descendant of Thomas Cook, as in the travel agency business. And with that, they set up a property holding arm called the Ancient Buildings Trust. And this was the second building that the Ancient Buildings Trust bought.
Oh, I see.
So in the 1930s, and our then secretary, or chief executive, as it's called now, A.R. Powys, well-known member of the literary family from Wales, he came and looked at the building and decided it was worthy of the SPB's attention.
Golly.
And although it's being offered to them on really generous terms of £2,000 for the whole of the Sun Inn range, they still had to raise money and have campaigns. And then that begged the question, what happens if the property holding arm sells it, which eventually they did in the 1960s, because the donors would potentially lose their gift, because they had all kinds of people subscribing to help them buy the building. So they came up with an arrangement whereby the freehold was vested in the National Trust, and the society took on a 300-year-long lease, which I'm told is the longest, or one of the longest, on the National Trust estate today. So that's effectively what I've got.
So you're the leaseholder of the building.
That's right, the long leaseholder. So
a pseudo SPAB stroke National Trust freeholder.
Exactly. So, and in between it was the larger part of the building was an antiques and bookshop. The part we're now in. Next door, it had an elderly lady at that point, up to about 2008, I think, when she moved into care locally. She had been there since 1923, initially with her parents, moved in when she was young, and then later on, when she married, she carried on living there with her husband. Then he died, and shortly after that, she went into care. And I did have the opportunity of meeting her, and got a recording somewhere of me having a chat with her over tea and scones on a bank holiday one year.
So given she was there from sort of the 1920s, you said?
That's right. I think it was something like 1923.
What sort of a state was it in from the 1920s? So my very limited experience of when I've bought a property in order to renovate from an old person that's been lived there for 20 years. When they moved in is when they did the work, and probably not a great deal of updating during the duration. Is that a similar story from the 1920s?
Was part of next door, where the old lady and husband were living, was very much sort of semi-modernised, as in 1950s stroke 60s. The other part of the building was just used for storage for the antiques business. So I've still got the pre-1960s brown paint finishes, all of that kind of thing, open fireplaces. Whereas the other part, where the couple were living, it had white gloss-painted anaglypta, gas fires, fitted carpets, liner, exactly.
So when you first took over the buildings next door, they obviously needed a lot of work. And what was your original intention for them?
So initially, I bought it with a renovation mortgage. So the initial plan was to actually put in a toilet and a bathroom, because basic services were pretty limited. They had an outside loo, and there's no inside bathroom, and very limited in terms of electrical supply and all of that side of things. There's just one tap inside. So really basic conditions. So the idea was to modernise the kitchen and bathroom, and then to basically switch to a cheaper mortgage deal. But because of the stock market it was a tracker mortgage, things tracked down, so it worked in my favour. So I could then concentrate on what was important to me in the building, which was to conserve the decorative plasterwork on the exterior, the pargeting, as it's known, which is among the best in the country, and why the building or the range is Grade 1 listed. So that enabled us to focus on that and do that, and some work to the roof to stop water leaks, rather than do the things more for human comfort in order to change the
indeed, it's quite an unusual approach compared to some.
And I had the luxury of being able to do that.
Which I guess would be on the commercial aspect of it. I need to get this rented. I need to do whatever to earn a living.
Yeah.
Actually,
Yes.
Your heart really, quite frankly, ruling overhead. Dare I say it? I suppose in terms of what's right for the building, as opposed to what's right for your pocket. Which is perhaps different to certainly how I've done things in the past, which is I've got to get this on the market by such and such a time. But it was on preservation as opposed to, I suppose, making it pay in a sense.
That's right.
Which is advantageous with the market at the time.
And the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, in their guidance note on building conservation, talk about an old building being rather like an extra client. And I feel that the building has its own needs, and you do need to factor those in.
The other thing, I mean, although your approach and how you dealt with it may be different to a lot of homeowners who've got perhaps slightly different priorities, or as Rich has just said. However, you just mentioned that the first thing you did was sort out the roof and the exterior. And I think my experience is people often focus on the interiors and what they're going to look at and live in, forgetting that if they don't sort out the exterior, they could become a cropper. So what sort of problems did you face when dealing with the exterior? Did you have to completely strip and recover the roof? And what about the pargeting? What did that involve, and so on and so forth?
The work to the exterior, other than what we did to the pargeting, was really what needed to be done to make it wind and weathertight, and not in the more detailed work and insulating roofs and things. That was all planned for further down the line. So it's literally, we had a particularly bad leak at a gutter behind a back gutter to a chimney, and fungi inside actually, and causing a lot of water ingress. So that was a high priority to tackle that, and the usual thing of slipped tiles and slates. And then most of the rest of it was tackling the damage to the pargeting, which was occurring. So we had a lot of deterioration caused by pigeon damage, where pigeons were literally landing on the protruding head of one of the figures, and part of it came away. And
why were the pigeons landing on the part?
Did they
were
not
actually
style?
beginning.
Is that what they had an issue with it?
Well, I think they gave one of the figures a new hairdo, but they were also making a lot of droppings were coming down. They were roosting on some timbers under the on the edge of the roof, and making a lot of mess as well, which obviously wasn't doing the pargeting much good. So that we had to repair it and then eject them. And also we were facing damage from vehicles, where we've got high-sided vehicles opening, in one case, a door partly on the narrow pavement below. Lift came up with a hydraulic lift once the load came off, unloading stone masonry for local business. The lorry rose, and it's like a battering ram under the jetty. We had a chunk of plasterwork that came down. We've had vehicles that were mounting the pavement, and even though it's designed and been ramped for some decades to fend off vehicles and stop them doing that, the bit larger ones could still effectively bounce up onto it, and they would clip the door mirrors and lorries, for example, would clip off pargeting details. Luckily, after a campaign, we have got a number of bollards, which helps protect the building much better than it was previously. So what else we had? That was the usual thing of people had used with best of intention, but used the wrong material. So it's used hard cement over the years to do repairs, which wasn't working well with the old building, particularly a timber frame one that should be moving to a small amount with seasonal and daily changes in its environment. So we tackled some of that. And also we had the issue where the whole building was being lime washed, which was fine, and they'd unblackened the timbers in the 70s, but the timbers were being lime washed. And because lime wash doesn't adhere to timber particularly well, it was failing quite quickly, and the building was then looking shabby. So they'd come and redecorate the whole lot on quite a frequent basis, and progressively the pargeting details were being clogged up. So potentially we'd end up with just a few blobs here and there. So we then had as part of a once-in-a-generation campaign, hopefully, of repairs, to unpick the lime wash. We'd done paint analysis as well to see what was underneath, unpick the lime wash to get back to what was below. And there were some oil-based layers from about 1900 or the late Victorian period. And they were non-lead based according to the analysis. But there's a mid-brown scheme, which must have looked quite repressive with the darkened timbers at the time, and then a grey scheme on top of that, and then loads of layers of white lime wash. So we felt it would be too damaging to go beyond the oil-based schemes, so we just took it back to those. And that was enough also, not just for us to assess the repairs that needed doing under the lime wash in terms of the plasterwork, but to get it back to really sharp details. And then we were able to carry out the repairs using a mix of ancient and modern techniques. So more traditional techniques such as little mortar fills of lime plaster, whereas we used modern solution of using nanolime, finely suspended calcium hydroxide with ethanol to help it penetrate and help stop some of the powdering, which is also occurring to the plasterwork. And then we ultimately, after we'd carried out a whole series of repairs, including actually also putting a big rod through the head of one of the figures on the right-hand side, which is a bit like delicate brain surgery. We've got the longest drill bit, literally, that we could get from the builders merchants, and put the rod through just to, luckily it wasn't moving. The structural health of the building is pretty good, but we thought, well, while we're doing the repairs, got the scaffolding up, we may as well just take the opportunity to give it a bit of a helping hand. So it was about the plasterwork on the laths were about 40 millimetres away from the framing behind, as I say, albeit stable. So we did those kinds of repairs, and then it's all covered with a pozzolanic lime wash, so a modified lime wash, just to avoid us having to put such a build-up that we would have otherwise done of lime wash. And
so the pozzolanic, I mean, I know what that is, but for our listeners and viewers, you mentioned that you went back to an oil finish. Now, normally lime wash wouldn't stick to an oil finish.
No.
And pozzolanic lime wash, obviously a modified one, if you could explain that. But also, how does that retain the permeability, or was the permeability not an issue?
Yeah, you're right. We're normally concerned about things being moisture open with old buildings that, and often referred to as breathability, and not compromising that. But in this case, we knew obviously that the oil-based paint wouldn't be as vapor permeable.
Yeah.
And yet that had been on for 100 odd years and not caused any detrimental issues.
Right.
So therefore, it could be confident.
Exactly. So we felt that in terms of putting a modified lime wash on, so one with a slightly faster set, slightly harder finish, then that wouldn't compromise the breathability to the extent that it would cause problems, because it would be going on to oil-based paint anyway. And we actually added magnesium stearate into the top coat to help improve the water shedding of the lime wash. And it was a modern equivalent, effectively, of where they used to add tallow in.
Yeah.
And it's a bit more pleasant to use than putting tallow in. And easier when you come to redecorate. You don't get quite the rejection that sometimes you do if you try and re-lime wash over old lime wash with tallow in it.
Was this almost a homemade mix? I mean, using your obviously knowledge as technical director of SPAB, and I'm curious to know how you came up with that solution in terms of, there's my tin of paint that I'm going to paint on it. How did you understand the constituent parts of it? I mean, is it something that
to the conservator who was involved, Torquil McNeilage, and also to a number of line companies and specialists. And between us, we came up with what we felt was the best solution.
Bespoke, tailored, mixed for...
Yes.
Right.
Also, we changed, I was particularly keen to get away from the meringue white finish. That it looked okay, but it wasn't particularly traditional for the building.
Okay.
And the analysis had showed that we had originally a buff-coloured, sort of yellowish lime wash below the oil-based paints. And I think that, I'm told, that was fairly typical of pargeting, a lot of pargeting in East Anglia, where it's been analysed. And just by taking a shade off of white, with a hint of yellow, I think it softened it, and people seemed to like it locally. One person said they preferred the white, but everyone else said they liked the off-white. So I guess you win some, you lose some. But
I've seen it at a sunset, and it glows. when you go past at the sunset, it
Okay.
glows.
Yes.
In a way I don't think it would have done if it was tree line.
No.
But going back to the paints, it's interesting what you say, because we read so much on different forums online about people. You've got to get back to the original performance of the building, and here that would suggest that you should take off all the oil paint and go back to the traditional lime wash. But here, obviously, there's a balance, because if you'd have done that, you'd have caused more damage, presumably.
Yeah.
So it is, dare I say it, horses for courses.
Quite. And lower down, I think the Victorians did do a lot of work where they used harder plaster anyway. So we have to take the overall context into account. And at pavement level, where we're getting quite a lot of rainwater splash coming up, we need something that, is going to be durable and not something that's going to erode away quickly. It's got to be a practical solution.
Yes, so could you tell us a little bit about the history of the pargeting itself?
Yes, with old buildings, we often say to people, don't try and rewind them to day one in their life. You strip away all the layers of history. And with our building, it's claimed that Cromwell literally stayed upstairs, and the experts seem to think that could well have been the case. It's not just a ruse for tourists.
He's written what the words Oliver Cromwell on a pen,
Exactly, yeah. Ollie was here behind the fireplace or whatever. But, so we could have literally the floorboards that he walked upon. So people said, why not take we had one group round from France where their approach was slightly different. And they said, why not take the ceiling out and open up the original hall to the full height? And I said, well, the boards above here potentially could have been where Cromwell's feet walked, So it's important to keep all the layers of history. And also, if we did that, we would strip off all the pargeting, because that's several centuries later.
Which era do you pick to go back to?
Right, so we've got a building that is believed to date from the 14th century. The pargeting itself, the earliest phases are from the 17th century, we think from about 1670 or so. And then we've got down this end of the building areas of Victorian pargeting. So it was important that we kept all those layers and didn't try and do any restoration where you're technically taking a point back to a real or imagined point in time, but you work with the building and conserve it and use a gentle, light touch.
Which is very much, correct from wrong, the SPAB approach to things, unlike some of the other conservation approaches.
Exactly.
So the SPAB is, correct me if I'm wrong, please, but the natural evolution. It celebrates the natural evolution of the building, what it's been through. In
it's additive rather than subtractive. So that's not to say you keep every single thing, but often there are things that from later periods that are worthy of retention and are part of the history of the building.
So what does the pargeting depict?
That's a good question, and one on which at the far end of the building, where we've got the two unusual figures in relief, different theories say they're Gog and Magog, or Thomas Hickathrift, a local carter versus a Wisbeach giant. There are theories that it's to do with the solar and the lunar, and we've got things pointing up and some things pointing down, and the sun swings round in the evening and first catches the thumb of one of the figures, and people read all kinds of things into that. But in my view, I think it's highly likely from the research I've done that it relates perhaps to a novel by the author William Winstanley. And it's been suggested that it might be something like Sir Billy of Billericay, one of his stories. He was a local author at the time, and his nephew was Henry Winstanley, who built and died in the first offshore lighthouse at Eddystone in a big tempest in 1703. But he was a clerk of works at Audley End, apparently very highly rated by Sir Christopher Wren. And I think the early pargeting is of such a high standard that it wouldn't have been done by a local jobbing builder. But perhaps Winstanley brought some of the team across from Audley End. But it certainly got the Winstanley sort of maverick kind of nature and character to it. So I think that's the line of investigation that we'd like to explore further. But then we have got, in addition to the two figures, with the big circle in between, which some people say is a wheel, others say is the sun. In some of the old illustrations, it's got the sun painted and a board below saying commercial inn, so effectively like a glorified pub sign. But from the evidence we have so far, there's nothing that suggests it was an inn before 1745. So we've got an illustration that we've had blown up from 1836, where it appears to say Sun Inn, established 1745. The earliest written records to the inn by the sign of the sun that we found in the Essex Record Office are from the 1750s, which seem to tie in. So we're not entirely sure why the pargeting was done originally, but it's particularly at the west end of the building, and with the more later the more recent pargeting, the Victorian pargeting at the eastern end here.
Would love to pick up on some of the challenges you found with the myriad of different, how do we call it, I guess, bureaucratic processes that you've had to go through, both in being listed, being a leasehold,
yes,
and perhaps the other building regulations that you've got to do, because having wandered around, there are incredibly lots of low ceilings, higgledy-piggledy floors, all sorts of other things, and your intention is to have one part as a commercial enterprise, another part as a residential.
That's right.
Would love to unpack some of that in terms of the decisions you've gone to and some of the things, how to navigate that, if that's okay.
I suppose I start in terms of the consent process. So we've actually got 3 hoops to jump through effectively, and we've got the application all approved for the far end, have done for some time.
That's listed building consent.
Listed building consent,
permission,
exactly, and planning permission.
And planning permission, right.
And then for this end, we've actually got an application at the moment for listed building consent, and we've had the indication that it will be approved with conditions, which is what we are hoping for. So
to do roughly what, as in what are the, because of course a consent application is normally to change it from something that it was when you effectively when it was listed. So what sort of changes are you making?
So in this part of the building, which was formerly the shop with the flats above that were being used for storage, we're actually turning downstairs into an event space. Initially, the idea was to rent them out commercially, perhaps as shops, ideally, or otherwise as offices. But that would mean that people wouldn't be able to view the building so much and come and visit. And we've been trying various ideas, putting the building through its paces since we've had this end of the building since last year. And the tours and other events, we've had ghost stories, conservation events linked to the work taking place in the building. We've had an immersive art exhibition, art classes, art and wellbeing.
So for the members of the general public get to enjoy, of course, the building, as opposed to if it was just office space.
Exactly.
It would be,
and also we have direct control over the building then, and we can make sure that
the right
use is as
is
sympathetic as proper as possible. But at the end of the day, it has to earn its keep.
Rich mentioned some of the hoops, but you're a leaseholder. So what does that mean in terms of these consents and the use and how you use the building?
So the National Trust have got the freehold. What I've got is a 300-year-long lease, which is effectively the same, but with certain covenants over the building. So, for example, it says we consult them over any major architectural changes. So before we apply for listed building consent with the council, which you have to do by virtue of the building being listed, we have to obtain the go-ahead from the National Trust, and then we can apply in the usual way to the council. And because the building has 3 grade 1 listings on it, in addition to a grade 2 listing at the back, but particularly because it's grade 1 listings, it goes to Historic England in Cambridge as the government statutory advisor for their say as well.
And of course, SPAB being a statutory advisor, of course, on a grade listed building.
Right. So they're one of these.
Who's the signature on the application? Oh, interesting. It's my boss.
So it's one of the statutory advisors
with SPAB.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Do you think that, of course, it won't have hindered, but the cynic in me is sort of thinking, has it been not so difficult, but would you think a mere mortal would find it just as easy to get consent, I suppose? Let me rephrase that. What I'm trying to get at is, or phrase it in such a way in terms of how much help or hindrance of you being...
Yeah, I think if anything, you could argue it's actually a slight hindrance, if anything. I don't think
more scrutiny, perhaps? Or?
Because you're being scrutinised more.
Yeah.
I think, and people are obviously expecting the best for the building, which is good. And,
yes.
And the amount of support locally has been fantastic. Even when we had to cover over the pargeting on the gable to repair the 2 figures, we boarded it over for 1 winter because it's so fragile. The local people were really on side and supported us and understood why we covered them over for a period.
What sort of advice would you give to a homeowner taking on a project that may not be too dissimilar from this, with all the complexity, in terms of getting through an application and making sure it stands the best chance of success? What have you found helps?
I think it's worth taking a measured approach. So don't rush into it, because then you've got all the unknowns further down that will trip you up and potentially delay you, and that's when the costs will spiral. So it's worth putting work in at the front to actually understand the building and get good information, which in our case involved a decent set of plans. So we decided to go down, particularly with the more recent application, we were able to use the benefits of 3D surveying. So we've got the laser, rotating laser, and we've got the ortho photography, distortion-free photography from drone-based photography, and together that provided all the cloud of data, the point cloud as they call it, millions of points of data to get really accurate drawings, because the building isn't plumb and square and everything is at jaunty angles and so on. So that allows also good cross sections. In addition to the floor plans, we've got plans of roofs, plans of the elevations, and we can do ultimately fly-throughs and all the rest of it, to put onto the website. But by having a good base set of information and really accurate measurements, that was, I think, an essential starting point. With a simpler building, perhaps you may not need to go to that length, but I think good plans on which you can then base your proposals, and where necessary bring in specialists. In our case, we had quite a lot of specialists, which wouldn't necessarily apply to a lot of buildings, like looking at paint and that kind of thing, the hardening investigations that we've had that would feed into a good condition survey. And I think the really key piece of advice that I would give people is to try and prioritise. So once you understand the building, and particularly what's important about it, what's significant, you can then concentrate on the most important things, and try and get a costed and prioritised schedule, so that even if everything seems overwhelming at first, you can pick things off and turn. And if the funds are limited, you know where they're best spent.
So what sort of surprises or unusual things have you found as you've undertaken the work?
I think in our case, we knew it was a complicated building, but everything about it seems to be complicated. So where we're sitting now, for example, the wall behind you, it looks like a nice salmon-coloured finish that we could easily just redecorate using the correct formulation of paint. Then we discovered, just catching it with a raking light at a particular angle, that there seems to be historic decoration below.
Oh.
So we now want to investigate to make sure we're not going to unwittingly damage something when we redecorate. And there's a new technique called spectral imaging, which we're hoping to try out, and then work out where the decoration is, and potentially then take some more conventional paint samples and analyse what's there. And that could affect the ultimate way we redecorate, and not just a simple quick redecoration that we envisaged originally.
Which, of course, extends the timeline somewhat in terms of getting this building up and running. But
exactly,
it's a dedication to your absolute sort of,
And we know that somewhere in the building there are all paintings in 2 locations upstairs, but we don't know exactly where.
Golly.
Thinking that one through as a homeowner, though, I mean, the temptation for a lot of people would be to come in and say, oh, I'm not sure about that colour, to just get rid of that and then just start again. Now, in so doing, they'd lose the evidence of what you were just explaining. Another approach would be to just carefully leave it as it is and paint over it, because most people wouldn't be able to afford the sort of investigations.
Yes.
So would you say that in situations like this where you're unsure of what they might be, rather than take off these layers, leave them?
Absolutely, yes. Then you're encapsulating them and they're there for the future. So that's definitely approaching it. Might be what we end up doing, but we'll investigate first and then decide which course we take.
Because technology moving on all the time, this spectral analysis you were talking of 15, 20 years ago, I'm assuming, wasn't at the stage where we could have done this. So who knows, in the next 10 or 15 years, being able to see through walls to really sort of understand.
And we've also found 1 or 2 areas that initially weren't that obvious to us, but they're where you've got early, that's in pre-1500s, early grey schemes that on timbers and on edges of plaster. And to the uninitiated eye, it looks a bit like grime. So it would have been really easy to scrub that off. But because we didn't rush into it, so much damage can be done as soon as you take on a building, with the best of intentions,
filling skips.
Unwittingly filling skips and so on. So luckily we hadn't sort of done anything with that, but we'd now really realised what we've got there. And even things like where we've got some coat hooks that we thought they're probably cheap 1950s tat from
B&Q,
around the corner or something or equivalent. And they turn out to be, they've actually got the nice, they're Victorian and they hinge back and they've got nice pattern under the white gloss. So they are, historic.
Gosh.
So and then you think, well, actually, they're bound to be floorboards that we can lift to put soil pipes through and all the rest of it. And then you realise that actually the boards are really historic and that's so where you think that, well, there'll be some areas where we can run services. In parts of the building, actually, it's quite difficult. With having looked at it in detail, you realise you have to rethink things.
It really does bring home the challenge to taking on something such as this in the most sympathetic manner. There is going to have to be some sacrifice along the way. And it's then that very difficult analysis of what sacrifices is acceptable in order to make the building function for the future, I suppose, because it does need to have a function now.
Yeah, exactly.
Otherwise, it will be left to rack and ruin. Okay,
exactly.
What is sacrificial? What is not sacrificial?
Right. So that's where it comes back to understanding the building, working out why it's of significance. So in our case, particularly the pargeting, but we've got other elements like the historic paint schemes, and we've got historic smoke blackening from the medieval fires in the roof that's important to keep, along with some red decoration up there. But in terms of making the building usable, downstairs, for example, we've only got one toilet, and we had a couple who came. We're not sort of planning to do big wedding receptions here or anything, but might do smaller ones from time to time. But anyway, we had our arms twisted to have 80 people for a sit-down wedding reception here earlier in the year.
One toilet's not going to
and one toilet, and which obviously they were nervous about. But it's a relatively new one. It's never let us down, and it was absolutely fine. But longer term, we do want an extra toilet. And we've come up with I've lost count of how many different positions we've decided, where we thought, well, actually, it can go there, and then, well, actually, it would be better there. But we're going to put it in a back corridor, actually, which means we lose the passageway going into the garden. And then I'm going to take out a sash window, but not one that is particularly historic, to have a new door. So there is a degree of harm, as the planners call it.
But mitigated.
But we're justifying it in terms of the benefit to the building overall and retaining it in use.
So we were just talking about how you tried various positions to put toilets in. But services and putting services into a building like this is always going to be a challenge. But I understand you had a particular challenge when it came to the electrics.
Yes, we found, for example, in a room next door that they'd actually, while they'd done it very discreetly in the 1960s, when they installed the electricity installation, we found that the light switches, for example, were on a beam where the previous shopkeeper had to turn the lights on and off with a broomstick, which is obviously totally impractical. And again, woefully inadequate number of sockets, with all the modern mod-cons that we've got, where we need far more socket outlets. And in addition to that, quite understandably, I can understand why they perhaps did it, but they put several electrical installations into one to save on the standing charges and reduce the electricity bills, which meant the system was teetering on the edge of its capacity. So we've had to have some emergency upgrading done. Ultimately, we have the whole building rewired, and we have to use pyro, or mineral insulated copper sheath cabling, which is more robust.
Is that part of that? Obviously, for fire protection, because this is
it is, yes, durability, yeah.
With regard to regulations, we were talking before in terms of the challenges that you're finding with the current building regulations, and with two flats that are above this. With regard to having a protected exit and so forth, and with the building regulations, again, it comes into where is the least harm with regard to making the building functional as today as being fire safe, but also where are the protected exits and having to cover up certain things and intermittent strips and fire safe doors.
Exactly.
That must be a real challenge here in terms of how are you navigating
the challenge is particularly in terms of things like the Regulatory Reform Act for fire, which applies to the retail use downstairs or the commercial area, where also if we're then coming up against domestic areas, you need an hour fire protection between the two. So obviously we're trying to do that in a way that is sympathetic and drawing on advice like the Chatham Row fire testing that they did some decades ago to show that lard and plaster actually performs reasonably well in a fire. They've tested it in reality when they set fire to a building in Bath. So we can draw on all that evidence. And yes, some areas will have to, for example, in the cellar, underdraw the ceiling with fire-resistant boarding, which is I would say, some impact in terms of loss of character. But then at the end of the day, if it's improving the fire safety of the building as well as obviously the safety, particularly
It's
for
always the balance
as
as
well.
well, I
It's
suppose. Yeah.
striking that balance. And upstairs we've got rooms within rooms, and the windows aren't large enough to classify as escape windows. We can't alter them without destroying
Nor would you want to.
significance.
Yeah.
Exactly. So we're then looking at putting a sprinkler system in to help mitigate there. And it's trying to find ways that
And then the
work
services,
with
of
the
course,
building.
water gets the sprinkler system, which we just
Exactly, and
discussed.
keep the services where we can to the back of the building, the areas that have been either extensions or altered in the past to a higher degree, rather than in, say, a panelled room such as this.
You just talking about windows there, and I'm looking at, you've got some fantastic windows in this building of various
Yes.
ages by the looks of it. But of course, one of the challenges at the moment is heat loss, particularly through windows. It's something that concerns a lot of people. And of course, here we're sitting in a timber frame building, presumably with no insulation in the walls, and so on and so forth. So in terms of the heat loss performance of this building and air tightness and things like that, what have you found so far, and what are you planning on doing in future?
Right. So in terms of, so two elements really. In terms of the insulation, we've actually had the particle board studied as part of a dissertation where a student has been monitoring it and doing in situ U-value testing, and the figures came out surprisingly well, actually. So I think the thick build-up of plasterwork for the pargeting has helped with that. So the U-value, starting with a realistic U-value, that means that we don't have to stuff in so much insulation, which can be potentially damaging and trigger off damage, decay and mould and all the rest of it, and potentially asthma for humans, or for occupants. So that was a good starting point. But equally, having lavished quite a lot of time and money on the pargeting conservation, to a degree, we want a little bit of heat to come in. It's not the same with every building, of course, but in our case, to come into the pargeted street elevations to avoid the amount of frost damage that had been occurring previously. And in doing so, I think if that cuts down on the amount of repairs later, you could argue, well, that's saving energy.
That's interesting.
Then,
It's not an aspect I really would have considered. So allowing heat loss from the rooms, basically, to put a little bit
within reason. So just a small amount to keep the wall, try and keep temperatures fairly even, including. But for windows, we've actually applied for listed building consent. Not that we now need it with the latest guidance, but we'd got approval to put in secondary glazing in a lot of the areas, particularly the domestic areas, which I think would work really well, and it would help, particularly in addition to providing us with some insulation from the noise. So
of course, the road noise,
from the street outside. So that's got the double advantage. So the insulation has been one part of it, looking at that and natural materials and so on wherever possible. Being aware also of fire safety, I think for the lofts we're probably looking at mineral wool in terms of getting the best fire rating that we can, but not something that is plastic based and is going to suffocate the building. So that's a bit of a compromise there. Yeah. But coupled with insulation, there's, as you mentioned, the air tightness, because there's no point in having a well-insulated building if it's being bypassed by leaks and so on. So we have carried out some air tightness testing and discovered, for example, in one part that we're losing as much heat around the back door as around the edges of all the windows in that particular area. So it helps focus where we go with our energy efficiency and our proofing measures. But the overall value of the air tightness testing, in addition to giving us the figures for different parts of the building, it gave us an overall figure, and it was actually within the modern building regulations figure, which was not
incredibly surprising.
We didn't
for a big old timber frame, 400-year-old building plus.
Right. So having said that, some of the materials in place were 1950s lino, which wasn't doing the building a great deal of good in terms of its breathability. So we've had to take some of those materials out, which has meant it's become more leaky. But ultimately, once the work's taken place, then the leakiness should reduce again to get to strike the right balance.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think people would be interested in is the fact that, like Rich, you're a bit of a DIYer, in as much as you've done some of the work yourself.
Yes.
And you spoke to us earlier about your background and getting into surveying, but you didn't mention anything in there about
on the tools.
any building works.
Yeah.
How have you found that, and how have you learnt to do certain things? What have you found?
I think having run various volunteers working parties as part of my job, I can then feel confident that I'm not going to, if I felt that I was going to damage or compromise the building in some way, then I definitely wouldn't do the hands-on part. And for things like the partition conservation, then it's really vital that we call in the right people and a plaster conservator to do that. And equally with gas safety works, you have in services, you need to employ the right people in electrical work. So I wouldn't dream of doing that kind of thing. But where it's more simple plaster repairs, perhaps internally, or things such as painting and lime washing, then I think that's something that's right up my street, and I've done a fair bit of in the past, so I felt totally comfortable doing that. We had some rather, we were trying to make the best use of scaffolding before it came down, which meant one summer holiday I was out there until dusk, every night, and it was quite high pressure and trying to finish everything before going back to work and so on. But yeah, it's a balance really, and I'm saving some money by doing work myself, but equally bringing in specialists that maybe would do more analysis because I'm interested in, say, the historic paint schemes that I wouldn't have done if I was doing it on a more commercial basis or it was a more usual building, I suppose.
Well, as a fellow professional, my father was a carpenter builder, and I grew up doing stuff for myself anyway, and I've always enjoyed having a go. And you've obviously, in what you've just told us, you've done a lot of hands-on work yourself. How valuable do you think it is as a professional to have experienced that for yourself? Because we see I meet a lot of younger professionals come out of college and they've never touched a saw or a hammer in their life.
Yes, yeah.
And yet they're trying to tell builders how to do things. So would you say that as a professional, how important is it to get some hands-on experience?
I think it's really important. Otherwise, there's that decoupling between on-site and what's going on in the office. And in the past, I think people had a really good understanding of materials, including sort of architects going back, say, to the Georgian period. From what we understand, they really knew what timber was best placed in what part of the building, and so on. I think there's a risk that can be lost if you don't have that practical background. And even things like, I suppose, with bricks, you work out that you can have, say, a certain number of bricks with a certain mortar joint, and then on site, so when you're designing, say, an extension or something, that you do it to suit the
you're not going to
brick.
cut a brick. You're not cut a brick every
unnecessary cut and end up with bits of small brick and all of that kind of thing, which is so often overlooked otherwise. So I think the practical basis is really important.
Okay, so Douglas, with all our guests, we've been asking them for their favourite book. Now, that could be a book of fiction that you just enjoy reading, but it could also be something that our listeners and viewers might find useful to them. So what sort of book or books would you say are your favourites, or you've found useful over the years?
So I would say two. I would name two. First of all, there's Alec, Clifton Taylor's A Pattern of English Building, which goes through building materials across the country, and it's a really good read. I really enjoyed it. And at the time, it was about the 1980s, when he also did a television series that is still available online, and including 6 more English towns, which covered Saffron Walden. It's charmingly dated, but well worth looking at. And he does focus a bit on the Sun Inn in the Saffron Walden edition. And then the second book I'd mention is the Illustrated Handbook of Vernacular Architecture by Ronald Brunskill, and building materials across different regions.
Of all the interviews and conversations with people, the same names keep on cropping up, and especially the Ronald Brunskill one, certainly, which you've done a video on.
It is interesting how but the Alex Clifton Taylor, I've got that book as well. In fact, it was one of the books given to us for the conservation diploma I did back in 1990. Excellent book. So I can certainly put an image of it on the video for those watching this. And we have found and put a link to the clip you mentioned of the I presume it's on YouTube.
Yes, yeah.
So
I've watched, I think we watched like Stamford. We watched a whole lot about a year ago. And yeah,
excellent.
Ludlow, I think was the one. Yeah.
So the other thing we'd like to ask is, in the same sort of vein, is there a particular building that you like? Could be anywhere.
That's a difficult one. I don't know if there's a single building I would name, but I think one of my favourites is certainly Durham Cathedral. And I remember going there when I was at school, and we were putting on a performance one Easter of Handel's Messiah, and it was performed in Durham Cathedral, and just really struck me the Norman columns and really made a nice, fantastic impression. But also I do like vernacular architecture, so all the smaller, more humble buildings, including, I would single out perhaps East Lexham Church in Norfolk with the wonderful, really crude Saxon round tower.
Oh, okay, I'm not familiar, but again, we'll stick a photo on for the YouTube side of things. But
that's somewhere for us to visit.
It is, exactly, yeah. Well, Douglas, it's been fascinating talking to you, and I hugely appreciate you hosting both Stephen and I here. For the members that are listening and or watching, how would they get in touch with you to understand more about the project you're doing here, or how would they get in touch with you professionally? We'd love to know.
They can contact me by my website, which is an easy one to remember, I think, www.oldsunin.com.
Perfect.
So that's a very basic website at the moment. We're planning to develop it as we do work and with the events that are taking place here.
So just with that, sorry, is that going to be sort of advertising the events and how people can rent it, or are you going to actually be covering some of the renovation works and doing almost like a blog on that?
All of that, yes.
Oh,
and it's linked to, we are also on Facebook and Instagram under Old Sun Inn as well.
So you already have some events, because I've seen some in the past, you've mentioned some. Presumably you put those on your website and on social media?
We do, yes. So people can see the events that we're planning
so
there.
If we provide a link to your social media outlets, whatever they might be.
That would be great. We've got a whole range of things. We've had an M.R. James evening a couple of nights ago here. We had another Ghost Stories event in the month before. We've had a wedding this year here, wedding reception. We've had immersive art. We've had art and wellbeing classes.
Yeah. Whole range
of, and we've got a charity concert as well. Right. In aid of various dog charities. So
not too heavy rock.
No, it's going to be just acoustic guitar, I'm told, and it's in aid of various dog charities, including dogs that have been affected by the flooding in Spain.
Right.
So that's due to take place.
Yeah, and you've got Joe Bisham coming to talk.
So Joe's doing some of the work here. So he's been helping with repairing windows, and it's a good opportunity for him to showcase some of his work and to explain, particularly to local people that are interested, and hopefully, highlight the ways that you can repair old windows and save them, not just put them on the skip or whatever.
So anyone listening or watching that wants to come along, look out on social media at the website and book up.
Yes, that would be brilliant. Yeah, and we look forward to seeing everyone. Yes.
Well, Douglas, thank you ever so much for having us. Hugely appreciate it, and look forward to seeing this progress. I think, much appreciate it.
Thank you. You've been listening to Talking Conservation,
the podcast all about conservation of old, traditional and historic buildings and sites.
with me, Stephen Boniface.
And me, Rich Aylesbury.